The road stretched out like a ribbon under moonlight, quiet and still, no sirens, no blaring horns, just the hum of tires brushing against old asphalt and the occasional flicker of a distant traffic light changing for no one. It was one of those nights when even the city seems to breathe softer, holding its breath for something it doesn't know is coming. Major Camille Brooks wasn't rushing. Her hands rested gently on the steering wheel of the black government SUV, her gaze steady, mind already half at home. After 7 hours of briefings and logistics meetings with the Northern Reserve Command, she had two things on her mind: reheated pasta and a warm shower. She wasn't wearing her uniform anymore. It was folded neatly in the back seat. Instead, she wore a simple gray sweatshirt with faded Fort King letters across the front and jeans that had seen a few long drives before. To the untrained eye, she looked like anyone else on the road, but looks are never the full story, are they? She drove cautiously, not overly slow, but deliberate. No drifting, no speeding. Her lane discipline was flawless, not because she feared being pulled over, but because discipline was muscle memory after 20 years in uniform. And yet, none of that would matter in the next 5 minutes. Not her record, not her calm, not even the federal plates on her vehicle, because someone was watching from a side street, and that someone had already made a decision. The red and blue lights ignited in her rearview mirror without warning, sharp, sudden, and final. No siren, just that intrusive glow sweeping across her face. Camille's jaw tightened for a heartbeat, then relaxed. She didn't panic. She didn't reach for anything. She simply blinked once, flicked on her signal, and pulled smoothly to the side of the road. A single deep breath, and then stillness. Behind her, the patrol car halted with a little too much urgency. The driver's side door slammed open, and heavy boots struck pavement in rhythm. Fast, deliberate. Camille watched him in the mirror. Tall, white, late 40s maybe, hand resting too naturally on the butt of his holstered weapon, flashlight already up like a badge. He didn't approach from the passenger side like protocol recommended. He came straight to her window, 2 taps. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. Camille rolled the window halfway down. Her hands remained visible on the steering wheel. "Officer," she said, voice even, "may I ask why I've been stopped?" The flashlight didn't waver from her face. "You were drifting between lanes. Looked like you might have been drinking." Her brow lifted, almost imperceptibly. "I wasn't." "License and registration," he snapped again, sharper this time. She moved slowly, methodically, opened the glove box, retrieved her documents, handed them over along with her federal ID. "This is a government vehicle. I'm a major in the National Defense Reserve, returning from post." He glanced at the ID and smirked. "The military doesn't put you above the law." "I never said it did." His posture changed then, a subtle shift, the way people lean when they're no longer listening but asserting. "Step out of the vehicle." Her breath caught. "Excuse me?" "Step out," he repeated. "We're doing a sobriety check." She didn't raise her voice, didn't plead, but her eyes stayed locked on his. "On what grounds, officer?" "I've complied with every request. I haven't been drinking." "Refusing a lawful order," he said, leaning closer to the window. That's when her thumb brushed the side of her phone screen, lighting up as she began recording. She didn't announce it with drama, just stated it plainly. "This stop is being recorded." For the first time, he hesitated. Barely. But pride is a powerful thing, especially when worn as a badge. He opened the door anyway. And Camille Brooks stepped out, not afraid, not defensive, just steady, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes forward. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she was ready, because the rules she followed weren't just ink on paper. They were the foundation of the uniform folded in her back seat. And this officer? He had just mistaken silence for weakness. He wouldn't be paying attention, but he might be the one who learns why that's a mistake. Sergeant Rick Dalton had worn the same uniform for nearly 16 years, and in all that time, no one had ever really questioned the way he did things. He was what they called old school. Early to clock in, quick to fill out reports, faster to dismiss complaints. He didn't smile much, didn't linger in conversation. The kind of man who didn't talk about protect and serve, but saw himself as a wall between chaos and order, a wall that didn't bend. He thought that made him respected. In truth, it made him tolerant. On paper, he was solid, disciplined, consistent, but something else simmered just beneath the surface, a quiet contempt for those who didn't yield, especially if they questioned him, especially if they were calm. The calm ones unnerved him the most. And Camille Brooks? She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't flinched, hadn't fed his authority what it so often demanded: submission. That alone, to Rick Dalton, was an offense. So, as she stood by the roadside, arms at her sides, camera quietly recording, he did what men like him do when they feel their grip slipping. He pushed harder. He called for backup, pretending it was protocol. He asked the same questions twice, even though her answers didn't change. He walked around her SUV, inspecting what didn't need inspecting, taking notes he wouldn't use. Every move was a test, every pause, a provocation. And still, no outburst, no panic, just that unwavering stillness. She wasn't fighting him, but she wasn't folding either. That was the problem. 15 minutes later, she was allowed to leave. No citation, no charges. Just a warning and a file number she would never need to reference. Camille drove off with the same steady calm she had arrived with, but something had shifted in her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was resolved. The next morning, the light from her office window barely reached across her desk. The screen in front of her glowed softly as she watched the video again. Not to relive it, but to document it. Every second mattered. His tone, the timing of the flashlight, the absence of explanation, the proximity of his hand to his holster. These weren't guesses. These were patterns, the kind that too many women, too many soldiers, too many Black Americans had memorized in silence. Camille didn't post the video online. She didn't call a journalist. She sent it quietly to the legal office at Fort King. Then she filed a formal complaint. She didn't expect an apology. She didn't want headlines. She wanted something harder to obtain: accountability. 2 days later, Sergeant Dalton leaned against the chipped tile counter in the precinct break room, sipping lukewarm coffee and retelling the story like it was a punchline. "Pulled over some government lady," he said with a smirk. "Thought flashing her badge meant I'd let her slide out of a check. Recorded the whole thing too, like that's supposed to scare me." A couple of chuckles echoed from the vending machine corner. But Officer Maria Chen, who had just stepped in, froze mid-stride. "What was her name?" she asked, tone neutral. Rick shrugged. "Brooks, Camille Brooks, I think." Maria turned slowly. "Major Camille Brooks from Fort King?" He blinked. "Yeah, I guess. Why?" There was a long pause. "She's the logistics commander," Maria said carefully. "Bronze Star recipient. Taught crisis response at the academy last spring. She's not just military. She's respected. Deeply." Rick scoffed. "Still just a driver on my road." But Maria didn't smile. "She's the kind of person whose name doesn't sit quietly in a report. If she filed something, it won't be buried." Rick laughed it off, but something in Maria's voice clung to him like smoke. A thin, unsettling truth he couldn't wave away. Later that night, alone in his cruiser, Rick Dalton stared out across a dark parking lot. The smirk had faded. That name, Brooks, now felt heavier, like a key he'd just used in the wrong lock. He told himself he'd followed procedure, that he hadn't hurt anyone. But somewhere beneath the silence, he knew what was coming. He could feel it, not like a threat, but like a storm he could no longer outrun. And somewhere in a quiet office, Camille Brooks was already preparing, not to retaliate, but to reveal. Because some battles aren't fought for vengeance. They're fought so that the next time, there doesn't have to be one. The courthouse wasn't crowded. No camera crews waited on the steps. No protest signs. No headlines. Not yet. But there was something else in the air. That quiet pressure just before a tide turns. The kind that makes people stand a little straighter, listen a little harder, breathe a little slower. Major Camille Brooks arrived early. She wore her full dress uniform, every metal polished, every crease precise, every detail a testament not to pride, but to purpose. Her presence didn't demand attention. It commanded stillness. She didn't need to speak to be heard. Not here. Not anymore. Inside, Sergeant Rick Dalton sat beside his lawyer, shoulders slightly hunched, tie pulled too tight against a collar that suddenly felt smaller than it used to. His eyes flicked up when she entered, and for the first time, they didn't hold defiance. They held weight, because now he knew. He knew who she was, and more importantly, what she represented. When the judge entered and called the room to order, the formality began. A low murmur of shifting chairs, the shuffle of paper, the kind of silence that comes not from emptiness, but from people bracing for what they can't predict. The prosecutor stood. Major Brooks, please describe what occurred on the night of February 11th. Camille rose. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't swell. It simply filled the space with clarity. I was returning from a logistics meeting at Fort King, traveling in a government-issued vehicle. I obeyed all traffic laws. I was stopped without explanation. When I asked why, I received no answer. When I asked again, I was ordered out of the car without cause. That's when I began recording. No embellishments, no performance. Just the facts, stripped of any need to prove what the evidence already did. Then came the video. First, her phone recording, her voice calm, her movements deliberate, her questions reasonable. Then the footage from Dalton's dash cam, his clipped tone, his refusal to explain, the way his fingers hovered a little too close to his holstered sidearm. There was no slurred speech, no erratic driving, just a quiet woman in civilian clothes being treated like a threat for reasons no one could quite explain. The room leaned forward, not in shock, but in recognition. This wasn't new, but this time it wasn't dismissed. Dalton didn't take the stand. His lawyer did what he could. Couldn't it be that Officer Dalton was simply doing his job? Camille turned her head slightly. Her eyes met the lawyer's, steady. Doing your job doesn't mean silencing questions. Power isn't a license. It's a responsibility. You could hear it the moment her words landed, the pencils that stopped scribbling. The courtroom held its breath. Then came the question that broke it all open. Sergeant Dalton, had you known she was a major, would you have acted differently? Rick's jaw tightened, and then the truth slipped through. Yeah, probably. That single word rang out louder than any gavel. It echoed not just through the room, but through every unspoken assumption that held up the kind of behavior no one wanted to admit still existed. Because this wasn't about a missed turn signal. It was about who gets questioned and who gets believed. It was about ego disguised as duty. It was about what happens when someone finally says, enough. Camille didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply gathered her notes and sat down. The courtroom was still, not stunned, but sobered. This wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning, a reminder that accountability doesn't always arrive with fury. Sometimes it comes dressed in quiet, with evidence, with rank, and with the courage to face the weight of silence and speak anyway. 3 days passed. No headlines, no protests, no sudden collapse of the system. Just paperwork, deliberations, and quiet. But behind those walls, justice was moving. Slowly, deliberately, like it always does when it wants to be taken seriously. The final day was quieter than the last. No packed gallery, no eager cameras, just Camille Brooks, her lawyer, a few curious locals, and Sergeant Rick Dalton seated at the defense table in a suit that didn't quite sit right on a man used to dictating from behind a badge. The judge entered. A small woman with steel in her spine. Judge Elena Vasquez didn't need to raise her voice. The courtroom quieted the moment she looked up. She adjusted her glasses, looked at both parties, and began. In the matter of Brooks versus Dalton, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. The sentence landed without drama, no gasps, no cries, just a shift, like air being pulled from the room. Rick Dalton's face barely moved, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a swallow. Camille Brooks didn't react, not visibly. She didn't nod, didn't smile, but her exhale, slow, even, final, said more than any celebration could. The judge continued. Sergeant Dalton violated the plaintiff's constitutional rights during an unlawful stop. His conduct failed to meet both departmental standards and professional expectations. The gavel hadn't even hit yet, and the words were already carving themselves into record. There will be no criminal charges at this time. However, this ruling will remain a matter of public record. The court awards $35,000 in compensatory damages to Major Brooks. Additionally, this case will be referred to the Department of Justice and the Springfield Police Department for internal review and policy assessment. One sharp knock from the gavel, and it was done. Not a spectacle, a statement. Rick's lawyer leaned in and whispered something. Probably will appeal. But even he didn't sound convinced. Behind his silence, behind the stoicism, there was something else stirring in Rick Dalton now. Not guilt, perhaps not even regret, but realization. The realization that the badge on his chest didn't shield him from consequences. That someone like her, someone he didn't expect, had the power to say no more and make it stick. Outside, Camille didn't pause for reporters. There were none. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't even glance back at the courthouse. She just walked. Quiet, upright, unchanged in posture, but not untouched in purpose. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about the record, about what stays after the shouting fades. She hadn't come to punish Rick Dalton. She came to remind the system of its promises. And now those promises were printed in ink, permanent. A week later, whispers began floating through the precinct. Rick had been suspended, pending internal review. No press release. No big announcement, just a shift, subtle but seismic to those who paid attention. Some said he'd be reassigned to a desk. Others murmured that his career was effectively over. He still showed up, still clocked in, but the stride was gone. The room was no longer straightened when he entered. He was no longer the storm people nodded at, just the shadow it left behind. And Camille? She didn't follow the coverage. Didn't read the online commentary. She returned to her post at Fort King as she always had, early, focused, and composed. Mission ready. She declined interviews, declined praise. She didn't need to be the face of anything. She just needed the system to remember what it was supposed to be. And maybe for someone somewhere it now would. Because the goal was never fame. The goal was this, that one less voice would be silenced, that the next woman, the next soldier, the next citizen might not need a camera to be heard. The training hall at Fort King was spotless, floors waxed, rows of desks lined up like formations. The recruits were young. Most still had the cautious stiffness of new uniforms. Some sat upright out of fear, others out of pride. But all of them fell silent when Major Camille Brooks entered the room. No podium, no fanfare, just her, precise, composed, purposeful. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. She stood in front of the room and looked them over. These were not just future soldiers. They were future symbols of duty, of discipline, and yes, of power. She asked one question. How many of you believe wearing a uniform automatically earns you respect? A few hesitant hands went up, not many. Camille nodded slowly. I understand why you'd think that. It's what we're told, that rank demands respect, that a badge earns authority. But here's the truth. Respect isn't issued. It's earned, one action at a time. The room grew still. She took a few steps forward. Authority doesn't protect you. It challenges you. Every day, you don't get to silence someone just because you outrank them. You don't get to intimidate because you wear a patch, that badge, that title. They're not shields, they're mirrors. One young recruit shifted in his seat. Another lowered their eyes. Camille paused, then continued, calm, unwavering. Not long ago, I was pulled over by a man with a badge who thought power meant control. He assumed I'd stay quiet, that I'd let it go. I didn't, not because I wanted to win, but because someone had to show what silence can cost. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lose control. I followed every rule, and I still had to prove I didn't deserve to be treated like a threat. Another pause. Then, that officer didn't see my rank. Not on my eye, not in my eyes. He only saw what he thought was weakness. She stepped back. But leadership, she said softly, isn't about volume. It's about standing firm when it would be easier to walk away. No applause followed, just silence, but not the unsure kind. This time it was the kind that lingers after something true has been said. Camille gathered her folder, gave one last nod, and exited. No victory lap, no dramatics, just a woman, once silenced, now steady, leaving behind a lesson that didn't need to be shouted to be remembered. Takeaway message. Power means nothing without accountability. Respect is not worn, it's earned. And silence, when met with courage, becomes the loudest truth.